Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for our forum on affordable housing. I want to thank everyone who's joining us online for this forum. It's hosted by the state newspaper and the Central Carolina Community Foundation. There's no doubt that South Carolina continues to grow. 2020 census figures now put the state's population at more than 5 million. And as that population booms, it's become more and more evident that everyone deserves a quality, affordable, and safe place to live. But thousands of South Carolinians spend too much of their income on substandard housing. A 2021 report from South Carolina Housing found that over the last decade, the median household income has not kept pace with the rising cost of housing. Almost a quarter of renters in the state spend more than half their earnings on housing. In 2016, researchers from Princeton determined that South Carolina had the worst eviction rate of any state. So today we've pulled together a panel of leaders from various sectors here in the Midlands to talk about some of those issues. I'll go around and make some introductions. We have with us today Sue Berkowitz, who is the director of SC Appleseed Legal Justice Center. Appleseed seeks to help low-income South Carolinians overcome social, economic, and legal injustice in the Palmetto State. We have with us the Honorable Ed McDowell Jr. He's a Columbia City Council member, and he's made affordable housing a priority in District 2. We have Allison Terracio, a Richland County Council member who has focused on housing issues. Also joining us today is Larry Sally. He's the Housing and Economic Development Committee Chairman with the Columbia branch of the NAACP. The Columbia NAACP launched a pilot program to assist tenants and landlords during the pandemic. And last but certainly not least, we have Suzanne Brooks. She is the Executive Director at the Central South Carolina Habitat for Humanity, which we all know Habitat has been helping people with homes for many years. We know it's a work day, and we appreciate everybody who's joining us online. We appreciate our guests joining us, of course, too. And we know how tight folks' schedules are. So we're set for about an hour of discussion. So I'm just going to jump right into some questions. First one. Research from SC Housing found that 24% of renters in the state are spending half their income on rent. When members of our community are struggling to cover the cost of housing, how does that create challenges in other parts of their lives? And I'll open the floor to whoever would like to take that one first.
I'll jump in if that's okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, when we know that when people spend a huge portion of their income on rent, they may not only have to make hard choices about necessities like food, like medicine, but they're also challenged when it comes to thriving here in South Carolina. What it means is that they don't have extra money to pay for things for their kids to do after school. They don't have extra money for all the little things that help to kind of bring down that stress level when you're working so much and all of your money is going into just being able to live. That just creates stressors on a family. It builds up between the parent-child relationship. It builds up in the spousal relationship. And if these stressors kind of continue on, they can result in poor mental, social, and health outcomes for people. And so really having to put so much of your time and energy into just being able to pay the rent really results in hardship for people. So I know that there are a lot of people who are very happy that they can write that rent check because lots of people can't even make the rent check every month. But having that high percentage of your income go to just being able to keep a roof over your head really means that people in South Carolina don't have that extra money to really be able to thrive here.
Yes, Ed. Ed, I think you might be muted.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes,
One of the things that I think is very important as we talk through this particular issue, I think it needs to be clear and very, very well have an expanded view of renters and affordable housing and that sort of thing. I think affordable housing consists of inclusive, equitable, and safe places to live. Remember, you've got X number of folk who are being evicted primarily because of the other things that they've got to take care of. There has to be, in my estimation, a creative, compassionate options for persons who find themselves in those situations. Just remember, we may be at the front of the line today, but we may be at the end of the line tomorrow. It's a day-to-day explosion of what's taking place. When persons rent, we need to assure ourselves that persons' lives has validity, and that because you are a renter does not necessarily mean that you've done something that you ought not to have done. Everybody deserves a place to live. We cannot just arbitrarily evict folk without the whole notion of going through something that is comprehensive, something that is compassionate, and something that is doable. Those numbers, those numbers will drop when we are able to collaborate with each other to make sure that happens. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Um, Chris,
Yes, Larry.
I was just going to add, I think, when we discuss some of the issues leading to rising housing costs, I think we have to look at some of the contributors as well. And I think the lack of jobs, the lack of well paying jobs also puts a burden on families. A lot of times, the families that are working now, they're receiving minimum wage, just above minimum wage. They're forced to put themselves at risk by working on jobs, exposing themselves to COVID and other issues. And some of them are forced to take more than one job just to try to pay that rent burden. And it puts a lot of stress on the families. Those individuals are not there for their children. They're not able to be present in their lives like they need to. And a lot of times families have to double up in order to be able to meet those that rent burden. So I think there are a lot of factors that lead to the rise in rents and the individuals that are being forced to be evicted and not being able to pay their rents or maintain a stable place residence.
Thank you, Larry.
I also think we need to think about why don't we have the housing stock the affordable housing stock that's needed both in our county and our state. And I think we have to think about what do we want to be the priorities for our political leaders. And it's wonderful we have two on this particular discussion, but we also have to be thinking about both on a local level, a state level, and a federal level of what needs to be done. And we know investment in affordable housing stock has been something of an afterthought for many, many years in this country, and there was a big push for home ownership. And I agree, home ownership is a wonderful thing, but not always something that's available to everybody. And we need to think about how do we make sure that we have the a number of housing units that are available and the types of housing units that are needed for families, especially working families, seniors, those with disabilities, those who may be vulnerable, so that they can then do the things they need to be supporting their families. And it's not all going to pay for housing and utilities, because we remember that 50% is just for rent, but we're not talking about the additional expenses on top of the rent. And when families uh, are putting all of their money into rent, then they can't afford things like quality childcare, the transportation they need to get back and forth, the health care. And we need to make all of this a priority for people in our both in Richland County and the state as a whole, and bring all partners together to see what needs to be done so that we can make up for a lot of lost time.
Thank you much, Sue. Suzanne?
Yes, thanks. Sue made a very good point that, a lot of effort is being put into, the rent assistance programs. And as everyone's familiar, Habitat's mission is to provide affordable home ownership. And what we like to explain is that Habitat sits at the end of the housing continuum. There is a process that begins at homelessness and moves to the end goal of home ownership. And we see a lot of resources kind of funneling into that middle part, which is supporting rent assistance programs. It's absolutely necessary. And what we hope to enable and to empower our candidates to do is utilize those resources as a bridge as we provide financial counseling and opportunities for financial stability and ultimately financial independence, so that they are investing into the equity of a home that will ultimately become their 401k for many people, and break a generational disparity that we see in a large population within our community. So as a representative of Habitat and affordable home ownership, that's sort of the role that we see playing in the continuum of this, is allowing our resources and our education to help folks across that bridge of rental assistance provisions and make it to the end of the continuum where we provide affordable home ownership.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for your answer on that. Now we'll make a note on what Sue Berkowitz said. We're talking about just rent, being taking up so much of people's income. And you mentioned those additional expenses. We had a story today my colleague Morgan Hughes wrote. Folks might want to check out. City of Columbia, and Ed, this, City of Columbia water rate payers are some collective $18 million behind in water payments. So, the pandemic and a lot of forces have made things real for folks. That's just a side note, and a good point made by Sue
Chris.
there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Ed.
Man, and I know you need to move on, but just
No.
I think you're absolutely right. When you start talking about child protection, when you talk about kids being taken care of after school, you're talking about persons who are paying somewhere between $6,000 to $14,000 in child payments just to take care of their kids. You're talking about water rates that have become so astronomical for some folk that they're having. It's a montage of things that continues to erupt, and until we are able to plug that in a sensible, compassionate kind of way, they're going to continue to erupt and cause some irreparable problems. We're working very diligently with our water department to talk to folk about their delinquencies in water bills. We know that AMI has, of course, installed new digital meters, and some of those were plagued with problems. Some of those has been resolved, and of course, some continues to be resolved. So I think when we talk about renters, and we talk about all of the exorbitant expenses that they incur, when you got child care and you're paying that much for child care, something is going to happen.
That's right. I appreciate that very much your input there. I didn't mean to derail us into that talk, but it all does go into the same stew for sure. Looking at another question here, and again, Sue touched on something there a moment ago about there are various levels to this, and we hear about affordable housing and measures that can be taken at the federal level and the state level, legislature level, of course. But what do you guys think can be done on the local level to bring about change on issues like creating affordable housing, evictions, renovating blighted homes? What can we do on the local level to address that?
Chris, I'll lead.
Yes.
For years, I worked with a not-for-profit that was a housing, affordable housing developer, we built a number of affordable units in the city and in Richland County. And a lot of the funding that was provided to our organization came through local government, Richland County government, the city of Columbia, and some directly from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I think one thing we need to do is direct more funds to those organizations, because over time we placed an unfair burden, I think, on organizations like Columbia Housing Authority to be that entity. While that is their mission, that puts a lot of pressure on them to be able to try to develop new units, single family as well as rental units, to be able to funnel those families into affordable, safe, and decent housing. And then I think the other piece of that is some of the policies that have been developed by local government. I think, when the city went to a process of adding impact fees and more cost to the development process, that has deterred some developers from building affordable housing. When you're not going to make a lot of money on the back end selling that unit or renting that unit because of those additional costs, that's going to deter builders from saying, well, look, we need to build more affordable apartments, more affordable housing units. I think we have to look at a number of issues related to that. But as Sue alluded to, we have to be able to build more affordable housing units. We have to look at the housing stock that already exists in the city and the county and find ways to replenish that, either through rehab or some other process. But now you have, unscrupulous developers coming in, buying up those houses, and, they're actually, turning those over and renting those things for, thousands of dollars per month to families that can't afford it. So the housing stock is shrinking. And of course, that's creating a lot of the housing crisis that we face now.
Thank you, Larry. Other thoughts on what we can do at the local level to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I absolutely agree with Larry that there's a lot of work that can be done on a local level to incentivize and ensure that housing and the creation of affordable housing becomes a high priority. But if we only say it's up to the county or we only say it's up to the city, then we're being very short-sighted. It has to be a full package. What we have to do is make sure that we have the density zoning and the ordinances that keep some of the practices that we know often making people move from their communities from going into effect. We also need to make sure that we leverage all the different types of incentives that are out there, whether it's a state incentive, whether it's a federal incentive. And I think that we need to be putting more pressure on a state level. Those of us on a local level need to be putting more pressure on a state level to ensure that the resources are available that can help those who really do want to come in and build affordable housing, whether it's multifamily units, whether it's rehabbing current units, that there are the incentives that are there that make it so that they can make a profit, but also ensure that that housing is affordable. And in Columbia, we see a number of challenges because we also have a market where we have thousands and thousands of students who have come in and they compete for the housing. And I think that also causes the housing costs to go up. So if we can ensure that those tax credits are available, if we can ensure that our state fathers and mothers at the State House are looking at the city of Columbia and ensuring that we are coming up with good local planning and then helping identify the resources, this can be solved, but it takes the will of everybody to work together.
Thank you, Sue.
I completely agree with Sue that the implementation of equitable development is really key so that we're avoiding the gentrification of major cities that we see across really the Southeast and within our own state, as a matter of fact. With the influx of student housing, we're seeing this happen block by block where, historic neighborhoods are being taken over and built on in multi-story units that are not affordable. And so by enforcing an equitable rate within these areas, rental or for purchase, I think is absolutely key to being able to overcome the inequities that we see within the neighborhoods.
Thank you, Suzanne. Ed, I think you were going to.
Chris, yes, one of the things that I think would, and I agree with each one of you, one of the things that CHA has done is to initiate what is called the Vision 2030,
Right.
which will give us some places, some spots in Columbia for that sort of thing to take place. It is, I think, crucially important that our council at its last meeting sort of what we went through was an organizing process of all the committees. Our Affordable Housing Committee, of course, went through a process, a very elongated process. Initially, it was almost like a blue ribbon committee. This council has charged that we look at the Affordable Housing Committee with some clarity, some specific steps, and some places that are doable. We did not venture into that kind of conversation initially. The conversation was well received, but what we want to do now is to put more teeth into what an affordable housing committee looks like and what are the processes. One of the other things, of course, for District 2, that's 29203 and 4, of course, there has been some conversation about the East Central plan to apply for funds specifically for affordable housing. That plan is being talked about and being discussed. And of course, we're looking at this very positively to move forward. We're particularly looking at that, I think it's called the choice grant. And we want to make sure that this happens.
Yeah, I think I've heard Mayor Rickman talking about the Choice Grant Program as well. Allison, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I've just been listening to what everybody has to say, and I love hearing everybody's thoughts. And I also just want to lift up that on the local level in terms of Richland County, another thing that we haven't quite touched on yet is just holding landlords accountable for the state of their rental units, particularly. There's a lot of things that kind of are maybe code enforcement violations and things that really need to be tended to. And those things not only affect the people in the rental units, and sometimes those are people, I think we'll maybe talk about students and stuff later, but people who are not invested in keeping the rental property maintained, and that spills over and affects the rest of the community. So I think partially is just we need to really look at how we address rental units, particularly rental units that are owned by people outside of the state of South Carolina. These are investments for folks. And previously, years and years ago, a rental unit would have more likely been owned by someone who you would see in the grocery store or you would see at church, and so there would be a social pressure to kind of keep things up. And now we really don't have that. And so another thing that local governments can do is just start to put some teeth in ordinances to hold people accountable.
Absolutely. And I think, Ed, I'm quoting, I think I've seen some, just because Allison's talking about that, aren't y'all in the middle of like an amnesty period for people to go ahead and get their rental permits updated?
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, Chris.
No, I saw where the city was giving people a chance to update their rental permits that allow them to rent property.
Yes, sir. That's correct. The other side of that, and I think Allison alluded to this, we've got to ensure and make sure, of course, what city council has done and will do, of course, there will be a conversation in full view of our rental issues, of the things that really that's a part of the city as it relates to the city, as it relates to rental pieces of property. Chris, I think you're exactly right. But that conversation actually ensued itself a few weeks ago as our council talked about. And as you know, some months ago, we talked about rental units and permitting AB and Airbnbs and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And we sort of put that on the back burner. That is coming to the front burner real soon.
Stay tuned. I'm certain that will be a fun conversation at City Hall.
Well, just my colleague, and I of course won't call his name. He's very insistent about making sure that conversation happens within the confines of this city.
Yeah, I think your colleague is probably Howard Duvall. I'll call his name. He's like Candyman if you say his name 5 times in the mirror.
What's his name?
Howard Duvall, I believe. Sue, were you going to say something? It looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah. I wanted to just kind of build on what Allison was saying about we really do need to be looking at conditions. South Carolina does have a landlord-tenant act, but it is not as strong an act as it needs to be. And when we start to do an analysis of what's going on and why we have such a high eviction rate, Columbia was number 8 in the eviction lab's highest per capita evictions for cities in general, and St. Andrews area was number 1 for medium-sized areas. And South Carolina, just as a state, has rated very high. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, because we don't have the enforcement that we would like to see. We get phone calls all the time from people who say, I have a hole in my floor. I've got to fix it because all of my money is going literally down the floor, all my utility money. I can't get my landlord to respond. When we say, have you reached out to, wherever you are living, have you reached out for any kind of code enforcement? And they said, yeah, but they said there's nothing that can be done. And I think that is really a role of local government for code enforcement to be taking care of that. Because if people can't repair and deduct, which our laws do not allow for, if they repair, they can't afford to pay, and all they're doing is putting a patch on a hole on the floor for somebody else to then have get that benefit for. And the other piece I want to add to that is, we know when people are represented as they're being evicted, that they will many times do much better with representation than without. And unfortunately, most renters in South Carolina who go to magistrates court, and I think we have to think pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, but go to court without that type of representation. I'm so pleased that the Columbia chapter of the NAACP has developed the Housing Navigator program, because they're looking at these issues about conditions and what's happening when people are trying to fix their place and they're not able to afford the rent because they have to fix their place. And I really do think that we need to be looking at things that are innovative, like we see in Charleston County with Housing Corps, with putting resources into the Navigator program that the Columbia NAACP has done with volunteers, and also seeing what we can do to be able to get more representation for tenants so that they can avoid these problems and be able to work with their landlord to get the repairs done, but also be able to stay where they live.
I appreciate that. Appreciate those additional comments on what local authorities can do. And Sue, I promise we didn't plan this. She just keeps popping them, rolling right into the next one. And so, Larry, I did have a question queued up specifically for y'all, and Sue just mentioned it there. Will you tell us a little bit about the Housing Navigator program?
Sure. The Housing Navigator program is something that we implemented last year with funding from the National Board of the NAACP, as well as some limited funding from the City of Columbia. And it's designed for individuals that are facing eviction that may have gotten a notice. They are struggling to identify resources and options. We set up a call-in line, or they can reach out to us online. We match them up with a navigator, a trained individual to direct them to resources. We have partnerships with Sue and her team there at Appleseed Justice, the Bar Association, and other organizations to serve as advocates on their behalf for individuals that are going to court. And as she said, a lot of times the individuals that we're working with don't have a lot of information, or they're being misled, or they're having trouble mediating that dispute with their landlord. So the Navigator program has worked with probably about 1,000 families since last year, trying to identify resources and find a way to keep them in that residence, or to find options for them as they transition out of those disputes.
Excellent. Good stuff. Yeah, I that was one I wanted. I'd heard about the Navigator program. I was hoping you could tell everybody a little bit about it. So thank you on that. Moving ahead, this is moving fast, just as I suspected it might, because y'all have a lot of good ideas here. One I wanted to touch on for sure. Statistics show us that the group that is most impacted by evictions is single Black mothers. Now, this is nationwide. Also, rates of Black homeownership are way lower than those for whites. What tangible steps can we take to start to change this in 2022?
Well, Chris, I think one thing that we need to do, and that was the focus of a lot of early housing efforts, is more education, preparing families for home ownership, for other housing options is very important, because a lot of times what happens, and the reason it's such a burden, is individuals come in there, they're overburdened by their cost for living every day, whether it's housing or food or otherwise. They get behind, they develop a bad credit rating, and a lot of times they don't have, their choices are limited. But I think the other thing is that we have to be able to provide incentives for those families, whether it be through down payment assistance or through lower rents, or at least control of rents, to be able to help those individuals become more self-sufficient. And, honestly speaking, for a lot of families, the mother, the family unit has changed over time. And the individuals that you find living in affordable housing, the individuals that you find that have a need for that affordable housing, are going to be, small families with single family parents, those kinds of situations. But I think there are a number of issues that surround that. But those are also the individuals that have the unfair burdens, because they're also in low wage jobs. So we find ourselves, really at a crossroads there.
And Chris, I'll reinforce your national average that Habitat has identified that 66% of our service population are single mothers with an average of 2 children, and they are African American. So we are seeing that trend ring very true in Richland County. And with that said, that home ownership and education piece is kind of what breaks that cyclical reliance on some of the housing allocations that are available, and allows residents to begin an education process and financial stability. And this is true for candidates who aren't accepted into the Habitat program. And it's something that I think is really interesting that I've noted from the United Way's community assessment that's been recently released, is that our community, of course, this is within the 6 county service area of the United Way, the population has identified that there is an immense duplication of efforts across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And so I think the resources are here for our community, but it's an over inundation of information. And so partnering and collaborating with our cross sector and non-adjacent partners is really what our community is hungry for, so that they have a more streamlined process to get the support that they need, and potentially provide them with the resources that are available, but they're hard to navigate just because there are so many duplicated efforts in our area. So I wanted to throw that into the mix, that we're very much on trend with the national average you referenced.
Thank you.
I'd like to add one other piece, and
Yes,
I
ma'am.
do agree that any kind of help we can provide with education and budgeting is important, but more importantly, we know that especially African American women are making much lower wage. And when we look at it, cents on the dollar are being paid a lower wage. And until we start having realistic conversations, and I think the pandemic has brought this out more than ever, we need to be talking about that. I mean, to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbia, South Carolina, you probably have to make close to $20 an hour. Does that account for also the costs of childcare? Does that also account for the costs of food and transportation? And we have to be really honest about, until we start talking about making sure that folks are afforded a living wage. And as Councilman McDowell said, until we start putting investments in affordable childcare, to make sure people can get to work through mass transportation, all of that is critical, because it doesn't matter if we educate folks, if they don't have the resources, they're not going to be able to do it. And then let's not talk about the targeting that goes on. We know when we're talking about things like high cost lending or payday lending or auto title lending, and those charges that are made and that help people limit their abilities to achieve, not only not achieve, but cause a debt spiral. We need to be looking at all of these issues and helping families, one, have the skill sets that they need, to bring business in to talk about. If you want to have reliable employees, you need to make sure you're paying them a living wage. Three, make sure that as on a state level, we make sure healthcare is available to everybody, for children and for the adults. And four, look at conditions of the housing that's out there. So all of that has to be factored in when we're talking about making affordable housing available, but also to make sure that people have the wages that they need to be able to afford that housing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And Chris, I'll just jump in here. Like, what I keep thinking about when I'm listening to everyone is that sometimes in order to own something, you have to already own something. And so we don't have, I think this speaks to kind of another question too, is like, we really don't have a lot of entry points into building wealth. So if an average home is $271,000, the barrier to entry is pretty high. And we just need more available points for people to start to own something.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ed, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, the thing that worries me probably more than anything, and I'm sure you all are inundated with those kinds of telephone calls. A mother calls me, African American mother calls me, and says to me that I've been put out of my house. I want to get another house. First of all, sometimes that old adage that says I can be property rich and yet cash poor. It seems to me that if we are going to, we just can't talk about this issue, folks. We need to put some wheels on that carriage so that folk can legitimately say, I'm a part of Columbia. Our city council is a part of Columbia. We want to do something that's going to be authentic, yet helpful in the lives of people. Right now, we've got a bill. We just can't keep talking about nor summarizing what we need to do. Let's do it. Let's do it. I mean, it sickens me sometimes. Not only do I talk to folk on the phone, but I personally make sure that I visit that place that they're talking about. How do you say to a single person, a single black mother with children, you got this expense and that expense? and they're on the corner. Our council has resolved to do something realistic and something very doable about this issue of let's build, man. Let's just simply build. We'll find the money. We'll find the resources. You got more resources there than you. Let's build. Thank you, Chris.
I will note that at some 40 minutes into the conversation here, the Methodist pastor did say, "We'll find the money." Uh, I will note that.
Yeah,
We can pass it.
if yeah, and let me say this because I am a retired pastor and I know the art of raising funds.
Yes.
Solicit you guys before I talk to anybody else.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
You guys have been you've been killing this forum. This has been really good. I want to get to one from a reader. We asked readers to send in send in overtures as well, and this is another one that Allison and also Sue have flicked at earlier in answers. They ask Columbia. They say and ask Columbia is suffering from a shortage of well-maintained, reasonably priced rental housing. From what I have seen, it is mostly driven by the substantial increase in students taking up much of what is available. What steps can be taken to require USC and other schools to shoulder their responsibility? And certainly we see this happening in other college towns in our state. So what steps can be taken to require schools to shoulder their responsibilities in this phenomenon?
Oh my goodness.
Does anybody want to jump right in that one?
Well,
We don't have it. We don't have anybody from the university here, but we, again, part of the district that I serve covers, I'll just name Olympia. And one of the things that they have been struggling with for several years has just been, the fact that these landlords, families who historically have lived in that neighborhood are now elder. Maybe the children don't want to keep the home. They sell it to someone. That becomes a rental. They rent it out for $1,000 a bedroom to students. And those students, the parents, I guess, think it's fine to pay $1,000 a month for a bedroom. And the students are not invested in, keeping the place tidy. And so what happens is that the trash builds up, the partying happens, and they become nuisance. And this isn't necessarily about affordability per se, but it does take a neighborhood that may have historically been an affordable, nice place to live for your average Colombian and turn it into a place that is a very difficult place for people to live. So again, it's not just about being able to write the check, it's about quality of life. I don't have the answer yet about how we can hold the university accountable, but we try to loop them in every chance that we get, because they can't just sort of have the little bit of housing that they have and then admit so many students, and particularly students who are, I'll just name it, from out of state, who have parents who are just writing a check, and the students have no investment in our state and in our community. This is a kind of a recipe for not great living conditions.
Well, I must admit that I've had conversations with developers who have done an exceptional job in building in state and of course maintaining that building and maintaining that it's credible student housing. Now, if you were to ask me point blank, Chris, what's my position? Sunset. There needs to be a sunset on student housing. It's affecting all of our communities. I understand the living situation, but I also understand, I think Larry sort of alluded to this very early on in this conversation about developers coming in, building, and then leaving. Some of the developers that I've met They are full of integrity. They are in-house or in-state, and they do an exceptional job. So to answer that question, Larry, I'm sorry, Chris, sunset.
Thank you, Ed.
Just going to add, outside of the student problem and being a guy that worked for a local college for years, I understand the challenge for the institutions themselves because, the cost of developing student housing in and around the campuses is difficult. So a lot of the colleges, of course, have turned to a model where they allow private developers to build units or rent units to students. But I think one of the other things that is a factor there is there's an aging housing stock in the city and in the county. Families that have owned their homes that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s that has aged out. A lot of those homes, families have not been able to maintain. Thus, they become nuisances in those communities. That housing stock has not been replenished or restocked. I think one of the other answers to that would be, trying to develop programs and policies that allow families or help families that want to remain in those houses, want to remain in those communities, maintain those homes, whether it be through rehab or whatever the case may be, so that those are viable housing units in those communities. One of the things that allows those unscrupulous landlords to come in is they're able to go to these families, buy these houses for pennies on a dollar, and then put a little money in them and then rent them to whoever may come. And usually those individuals that come aren't the folks that resemble the current residents of the community. And as Councilwoman Teresa said, they don't have an investment in that community. So they allow the house to flourish anyway. I will say quickly that I think the city of Columbia has a good process with the permitting process that holds the landlord responsible for those activities over there in the home. I have seen that has worked fairly well in terms of maintaining the quality of it. And when folks have gotten beside themselves, of course, they've had to call in, the ordinance folks to be able to enforce that. But I think that does help. So that may be one solution.
Mentioned our code enforcers, of course. Our last two council meeting, a presentation was made by the director of code enforcement, and of course that rental piece, and of course that whole student housing piece came into full glow, and of course more teeth were added to that particular ordinance. So it gives us some, Larry, it gives us some real leadway into what we want to do and how we want to do that. Thank you.
Good
And
stuff. Yes, ma'am, Sue.
I was just
Please.
going to say, I also think that what this often does is it changes the whole makeup of a community. And what we want to make sure Columbia doesn't turn out to be like Charleston and Greenville, where we're pushing people who have historically lived in the city of Columbia because they cannot afford to either bring their homes up to code, or they're being bought out because they can't afford, because they can't afford to fix it, and because they feel that there's a threat that they could lose their home, that they would rather sell than lose everything. So I think what we have to think about is there has to be a mixture of how we're approaching this to maintain the integrity of so many communities, especially those communities where home ownership was a part of it, and how we help people stay in their homes with rehabilitation of those homes, and make sure that we make Columbia remain the community that we know it can be, without pushing people out and changing the whole nature of what our downtown would look like.
Chris, I think that goes back to what we discussed earlier about equitable development and identifying the established neighborhoods so that we're not pushing individuals out, especially existing homeowners. The neighborhood revitalization program that's put in place by Habitat that partners with organizations across the Midlands makes that kind of a priority, is empowering the resident homeowners to address some of the deferred maintenance that they've not been able to manage on their own. And we couldn't do that without the partnership of the city and code enforcement, so that we can defer some of those actionable items and make it possible for homeowners to stay in place and not feel threatened to lose their residence.
We're actually talking about inclusive and equitable ways maintaining a community without that community becoming a part of a gentrification kind of issue. There are persons in both the neighborhoods that I live in and of course the neighborhood below me. There are some real historical roots there. We need to make sure that it's inclusive, that it's equitable, and that it's the kind of process that's going to expand homeowners and and perhaps renters also, expand that emphasis so everybody is included under this umbrella.
We've touched on a number of topics under that under the umbrella of that initial question, but I do thank the reader who's sent in that question about schools and universities, which are, of course, our institutes of higher education are very much a part of the vibrancy of Columbia, but we still need to find ways that it can work for everybody. We got one. This time is just motored by, but I want to make sure I get to at least one more here. How can we, as a community, change the mindset around development and get beyond the quote unquote "not in my backyard" stigma that can sometimes be associated with affordable housing?
Chris, I'll start off. One of the things that we did with the not-for-profit development unit that we had at Benedict College, we built homes that were designed to reflect the interests of the community that they were placed in. And I think the quality of those kinds of units and the way that they're maintained, the way that you identify buyers or renters has an impact in that. What's become negative to the community is when individuals buy units or build units, they turn them over to just anyone. They allow anyone in that community. And as Sue was saying, and Councilwoman Teresia, individuals that don't reflect the values and interests of that neighborhood come in and they turn it into something else. For example, we put conditions on the sale of every house that prevented individuals from parking on yards, having all kinds of nuisance kinds of items in the yard, those kinds of things. That was a condition of the sale of those units. We also, did home buyer education and training for families that were coming in so that they would understand how to maintain those homes. And then we used quality materials so that, you couldn't tell, for example, the affordable house from a market rate unit, which would blend into the community. It added to the value of that neighborhood. And of course, it made the neighborhood more comfortable and richer. So I think that prevented individuals from saying, we don't want this in our community. So I think that those are some of the early factors that you have to address when you're working with developers. You have to set a tone that, look, these are the kinds of things that we expect. This is what we'll allow, and this is how the neighborhood is oriented. And also letting the neighborhood provide some input into the development of new housing units and housing units that are being rehabbed in those communities.
It's in Edgewood, not only the units that we did with the CDC at Benedict College, not only did we do that on Reed Street, but I think it became a kind of collaborative kind of movement where folk were at the very beginning. This is what's going to happen. I think it's that kind of conversations we need to have with persons when they build those things.
Excellent. Sue?
Yeah, I was also going to say, and I think we have to have discussions within our communities to talk about that everybody does deserve quality, affordable housing, and that it's not something of privilege, and that it takes the entire city coming together. And when we're talking about housing density, that what we need to make, while those who live in certain areas have a say, they don't have the say. And I think that when we talk about NIMBY, it's often folks who are trying to make sure that their neighborhoods don't become more populated. And so that is, as we grow as a state, as we grow as a city and a county, we have to recognize, all of us, that things are going to change, and that we should all be welcoming, and we should all be saying, everyone in our city, everybody in our county deserves the privilege of affordable housing that's safe and secure.
I've told this story many, many times, but I'll tell it again here for anybody who hasn't already heard it. When I was able to take advantage of affordable housing when I lived in New York, we lived in a building where people had multiple levels of income. So we were at one tier, some people were at a higher tier, some people were at a lower tier, and we all had basically the same kind of unit. And when we walked in the door and got our mail and got into the elevator, and when we went to the laundry, nobody was saying, you pay this much, so you don't get to use this or that or the other thing. We all lived together. And I think that happens here too. We just don't name it in the same way. So affordable housing, I'm looking out my front window. The house across the street has a garage apartment above it. Presumably that is an affordable housing option for someone. And it also provides income to the people who are a little older and living in their home. Next door to me is a building that has 4 rental units in it. Presumably, hopefully, that is affordable. But if we can incentivize, for instance, that landlord to do some upkeep and maintenance and improvements on the property, that will improve this neighborhood greatly. So affordable housing is already in our neighborhoods. We just don't name it and recognize it in the same way that we name and recognize, for instance, a high-rise apartment building that only has a certain kind of housing in it. So I think that's one way that we can start to talk to our neighbors and our friends about affordable housing and help people understand what that really means.
Thank you. Suzanne, any thoughts on this one as we close up?
Absolutely. I just wanted to add that, as we invest in our communities, we're not only investing in the infrastructure, but, there's proof in the statistics that people who are proud of where they live they stay longer. There's less turnover in the housing. It allows for an investment into not only the community, but economically into the city and into the county. And so by making what is initially a marginal investment into our housing stock and into the affordable units that are available, we're investing dividends into the output back into our community through the residents that we're investing in. So it's ultimately providing a more stable, a livable, and enjoyable community for us all by just providing the most basic human need through affordable housing.
Excellent. And with that, this hour has gone by unbelievably so. I want to thank all of our guests, Larry Sally, Ed McDowell, Allison Terracio, Sue Berkowitz, Suzanne Brooks. I want to thank them all for the time they've taken to talk about this critical issue for the Midlands and for South Carolina. I also want to thank the Central Carolina Community Foundation for co-sponsoring this forum. If you want to know more about them, please visit yourfoundation.org. And please visit our newspaper's website, thestate.com, for news about housing issues and many other issues and news items that are of importance across South Carolina. Thank you again to all who tuned in online today, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Chris,
Yes, sir.
may I say a last word?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
And you know a retired preacher's gonna have a last word.
Right. The benediction. Is that what this
Yeah.
is?
Well, you can call it what you want to call it.
Yeah.
Let me just say this in conclusion. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village, the city, the county, all of our partners who are online today. It takes all of us, in addition to others, to make this a reality within the lives of our constituents. Everybody needs housing, but it takes not just one of us, but collaboratively, this village allowing something to come up out of the ashes. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. And again, thanks to everyone on this panel and everyone watching. Have a great day.